Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. In this episode, I want to build upon the conversation we had that was about being and feeling overwhelmed. And in that conversation, we had talked about how the experiences that we have of being overwhelmed can lead us to a response that's the result of us feeling unsafe, right? Feeling unstable, unsecure, or insecure. And this is natural, right? We have an idea of the way the world works. We've come into the situation, whatever that is, with an idea of how things will unfold in that world. So one of the examples I used, albeit a somewhat churlish example, but I used the example of going to cash out or to move to the cashier at a grocery store. And just as you're about to, arrive at that cashier, they put out the sign that says, "Next cashier, please." And you're rushed for time and you're frustrated because of all of the things that are going on in your life. And you feel that person has pointedly done that to you. And so that's occurring because within that mindset, you had already imagined yourself going to the cashier, putting your groceries on, having them, go through, everything goes smoothly, and then you go out and you bring your groceries home and you're on time or you're closer to being on time. And so in your mind, everything was working. Everything made sense. Even if there was bumps, you had a sense that, okay, this works. But the moment that sign, "Next cashier, please," came out, that whole projection of how the world works ended. So there's an expectation that happens. And when we feel overwhelmed, there's a lot of expectations, too many expectations. I talked about this idea of there not being enough hours in the day, not being enough days in the week, not being enough months in the year, and how we need more time than we have. And because we need more time than we have, we feel pressed for time. That creates this feeling of being overwhelmed, that we're trying to carry more, manage more, do more than we can within the allotted time that we have. And this resonates a sense of anxiety, a sense of anxiousness. And that undermines our feeling of being grounded in the world. So I gave the example of, in the previous podcast, of how imagine that we didn't have to do anything for 1 week except just keep up on the news. And I suggested that that's not even possible. Because in order to fact check and to really dig deep and to then have conversations with people, find out different points of view, debate different points, that would take more time than you have in a week. So it raises the question of what's reasonable as to what we can take on as an individual. What makes sense for our projections? If our projections are including doing way more than we can actually do, right? That we have this idea that in order to live our lives, to be happy, to, even more fundamentally, in order to survive, we need to do these things. And if they don't get done, it all falls apart. And so we are in this constant state of feeling overwhelmed. And sometimes maybe we make it through, sometimes we don't, but we keep on going. And again, this goes back to this idea of we have a projection of what we expect the world to be. So, another example might be as I get up in the morning and I have an expectation of the events during that day. I'm going to meet with some people, or I'm going to buy something, or I'm going to take a trip somewhere, whatever it is. And implicit within that is a set of expectations as to how those things will unfold. But then the interruptions occur, right? Things happen in life. We're going to take public transportation and it's delayed, or there's an issue with our car, or cost of things have increased, or somebody's no longer available, or the weather changed, and the plans that we had are no longer what we can do because the weather won't permit it. All of these different things, and including things like, of course, illness, death, loss of job, questions about our survival, safety, all of these things are being thrown at us. And so we've got an idea of how we would like things to exist. And we have these ways of controlling these things, which exist within our projections. And we've developed our projections over many, many, many years, right? We have ideological beliefs, whether they're in the context of religious or secular notions. We have political beliefs as to, politically this or politically that. We have all of these different ways that we have used to impose on the world to make sense of the world, and to do so in a way that adheres to this model of how the world should work in order for us to feel safe, to feel like we have meaning, to feel like we have purpose. And so we left last podcast on the note of what role does choice play in this? So we work through this argument, getting ourselves to the point where we're recognizing that we feel overwhelmed. We're recognizing that we're born into a world and that there's all these things that happen to us. Therefore, it's not simply the case that we should just actualize our best selves and further blame ourselves as if really what we need to do, and the only problem we have is we just haven't figured out how to make more hours in a day, how to make more days in a week, how to make more months in a year. That's insane, right? So this idea that we end up shaming ourselves, that because we have not been able to create more time out of the time we have, because we have not been able to handle more than what we can handle, that I was saying that this is analogous to the notion of living in a way that is unsustainable. And if we consider the environment here, we say, okay, well, if the resources that we need to exist in the way in which we conceive of the world outweigh the resources that we have, and the use of those resources have an effect on our environment that can threaten our lives, then it raises questions about the way in which we are existing in the world. Namely, it raises the question, is it sustainable? So going back to this notion of being overwhelmed and feeling overwhelmed, we started to ask the question of, well, is that sustainable, right? Is it sustainable to say, well, I've just got to figure out how to do more than I am now doing, or I've just got to figure out how to get 28 hours out of a 24-hour day, or get 9 days out of a 7-day week, and so on. I've just got to figure that out. Now, what we didn't mention is that that's understandable, right? Because we can't control the outside world. So we figure, okay, I'll control my kind of vision of the world. And that arises through this experience of shame, right? And our response to shame is, well, then I'll get control. But then notice what that does is that creates, because we feel shame, because we feel that sense of, well, I have to do this, it's on my shoulders. We then move from the shame to, I need to do something, my response. So we become more declarative. And then we say that declaration that we're making, that is the world, that is my reality. So in effect, we're kind of imposing this structure of oppression upon ourselves, which creates more of a feeling of anxiety and stress, hence a greater sense that we are, and a greater feeling that we are overwhelmed, right? It's now coming from within us. So what's happened is the implicit structure that you have to figure out how to do more with less. You have to figure out how to manage more. That is all on you. All that does is creates this pressure on us. But again, these are structures of how we are supposed to exist in the world. What I want to focus on in this podcast is what, and I'm going to say his name incorrectly, unfortunately, but Koichi Togashi. So I'll spell his name. His first name is Koichi, and his last name is Togashi. And he's written a book called The Psychoanalytic Zero. What I want to draw upon from this book, and I'll just speak generally about it, but you can pick up the book if you're interested, is what I want to draw upon is this notion that there are these ways in which we conceive of the world. They operate in an implicit way that then structure our relationships. They then control the dynamics of those relationships. So, for example, he talks about a case with a woman who comes in for counseling, comes in for therapy, and at a certain point, she starts to fall asleep. Now, he's thinking, well, what does this mean? Is this a form of avoidance? Is this, should I talk to her about this in this way or that way? So he's starting to project what he thinks he should do in his role as an analyst. She's having whatever her experiences are, which again are some kind of projection. Now, what he goes on to point out, which is interesting to me here, is how if we can find a tolerance and an openness to this kind of uncertainty, that we find this point of what he's referring to as a psychoanalytic zero. Now, this moves into this notion of intersubjectivity. Now, what this means is the dynamic is not in one or the other person. It's not a mediation per se. It's not a negotiation. It's not both parties get less than what they want and then they agree and then they move on from there. It is the creation of what is referred to as the third, which is to say there is this experience, this relational dynamic that is inhibited when either party brings their projections to the world. So for example, if we imagine this therapist, they're trained to help people, they've developed all sorts of skills, they've gone to seminars. In this case of this person, he's published, and he's done all of these really incredible, really wonderful things. And a client comes in and they have issues, right? They have something that is really bothering them enough that they want to go and see somebody and explore what that is. So they have these needs, these concerns. Both parties have these needs, just to be general about it. The process of getting to this psychoanalytic zero, and I'm going to tie this into this idea of being overwhelmed in a moment, but the process of getting to this psychoanalytic zero is acknowledging and recognizing that each are bringing in these needs that can interrupt the needs of others. In other words, we start to fight over the world, which worldview is right, which worldview is wrong. Now, just to give a bit of context here, intersubjectivity, it's obviously something you can, and if you're interested, look up, but generally speaking, what intersubjectivity is doing is changing the power dynamic between therapist and client. It's shifting away from this notion that there's a doctor and a patient, and the doctor has information, and the patient is getting that information and following that information because the doctor is the expert. It's shifting from what Paulo Freire referred to as the banking model, or others have referred to as the jug and mug model, which is something that we find in education. The idea is the teacher is the jug and the student is the mug, and the teacher is pouring information into the student. Or to use the banking analogy, the teacher is the bank and the student is going and withdrawing information from the bank. But that's clearly a hierarchical understanding of how information is conveyed. Somebody has and somebody else gets from that, or in whatever way receives from that dominant other. Intersubjectivity is challenging this, right? Intersubjectivity is saying there's something created, a third, an entity. The relationship is an existent. Right? You could say it is a form of being insofar as it's created as a result of these two people, these two entities, yet it is not either entity. And this is a shift, right? This is a mental shift. So returning to the psychoanalytic zero, and then we'll jump to the notion of being overwhelmed. Within the psychoanalytic zero and this idea of the psychoanalytic zero and the concept of intersubjectivity, you have the practitioner, in this case the therapist, and you have the client, in this case, the person who's come in saying, I need help. Regardless of those structural dynamics that each is playing a quote-unquote role, moving towards a psychoanalytic zero means what is happening is we're shifting to away from the roles that each have, right? So one is the therapist who's the helper, and the other person is the client who needs help. Yes, they start based upon that. It's almost like the premise, like the thing that happens at the beginning of the movie. Yet they need to peel those away, right? There needs to be a removal of being the client and being the counselor, being the helper and being the helped. Those things need to be pushed out of the way, let go of. They need to be seen as almost like you're looking through a window. They may still exist, of course, but you're seeing through the window. And what this transparency does is it allows individuals to move away from the preconditioned notion of the way the world works. So going back to the analogy that I was drawing upon both in the last podcast and earlier in this podcast about the individual who's in a rush, they're at the grocery store, they've got their cart, they're going towards the cashier, and the cashier puts out the next cashier sign, and the person gets really frustrated. Well, what's happened is there's two different projected worlds. Thus far, I've only talked about the person who is rushing to get their groceries, who sees an opening at the cashier and thinks, okay, I'm going to be on time, or I'm going to be closer to being on time. I'm going to get to the cash. There's nobody ahead of me. I'm going to be able to get my groceries through, get up back home, and do whatever else that I need to do. So great, everything's going to work just as I'd planned. The cashier is thinking, I've already taken on 3 people beyond what I was supposed to do. I'm late. I'm supposed to pick up my kids, or I'm supposed to meet my friend, or I've got to get to a class, or I've got to, whatever it is. And they're going to be upset with me. So I've got to put this sign up, and I'm in a rush because I don't have enough time to do this. And I still have to cash out. And I had this problem with my cash out because this person gave me this, and so on, so on, so on. That person is having that experience. Because everybody is overwhelmed, and like I was saying earlier in that example, which I talked about in the first podcast and reiterated earlier in this podcast, is even if we said all we're doing for 1 week is just looking at the news, and I'm suggesting that we wouldn't have enough time to really meaningfully dig down on what's going on in the news, challenging positions, hearing different points of view, and so on. Similarly, in this situation, we're not really digging into, well, what's the person who is buying the groceries and what's the person who is selling the groceries? What are they experiencing? What are their worlds? And so now if we take the person buying the groceries and the person selling the groceries and we put them into the therapist and the client dynamic, in whichever order you want, we see that there are 2 people with 2 different forms of reality, projections of reality, and there is not a recognition of a third created intersubjective reality. And the psychoanalytic zero, which I think is an idea that we can start to draw upon and think about in our own lives, raises questions about, okay, what am I bringing to this situation that is creating a structure for how the outcome should be, yet does not acknowledge that there are other people in this dynamic. So if the therapist, and there's much criticism, and I think appropriately so, with therapists who make it clear that they're running the process, it's their agenda, it's how they've been trained, and that training is based upon whatever evidence base or ideological base that they feel is foundational for the so-called right way of being a therapist. And so they're very, very comfortable in espousing the virtue of what they're doing and not listening to anything that doesn't fit their model. So this can be something that we can perhaps explore in future podcasts, the way in which therapists, philosophers, politicians, individuals become very grounded in the certainty of their ideological frame without understanding that it's an intersubjective experience that's being created. Therefore, what they are actually talking about and what they're actually engaging in is oppression. For our purposes here, staying focused on this idea of being overwhelmed and what we're experiencing when we're feeling overwhelmed, and this notion that we have a projection and a projected outcome, And in the first podcast, I said we have this idea that it's easier to change the world than to change ourselves. Yet, in this podcast, I pointed out that there's this implicit bias going on, right? That we have this notion that it's on us to resolve. Now, those may seem to contradict, but I would suggest that it actually supports the notion that our view of the world is implicit, right? It is something that we have within ourselves, and we haven't necessarily seen the extent to which it is our world and not the world, right? That it's an implicit form of understanding that is not necessarily shared. Now, you can check this, right? You can say, well, who are people that I get along with? Who are people that espouse beliefs that I like? You can say, okay, that kind of aligns with my world. Who are people that I don't get along with? What are beliefs that I don't like? Well, they challenge my world. They maybe even despise my world. But that actually illustrates the extent to which our world really shapes our reality. So let's just skip back to the Psychoanalytic Zero and the scenario that was shared in the book, The Psychoanalytic Zero. He has this client who is falling asleep. He feels like he is supposed to do something, but he becomes aware that he feels like he's supposed to do something. He checks with her. She notes that she falls asleep. She thinks it's interesting that she's fallen asleep. Then he notes that she tends to wake up 5 minutes, pretty much to the exact second almost, before the end of each session, which suggests to him that even though she has fallen asleep, there is some container going on. There is some experience happening. Now, I'll explore more of what that might be in the future, but for now, if we just think of it as there's a form of communication going on, this form of communication is on a different level. So the sleeping with the therapist present is communicating something about safety, is communicating something about security, is communicating something about self-regulation. It's communicating something. We're not going to get into what that is, and we're certainly not going to guess. But if we think about what it might be when we feel like we need to sleep, yet we feel like there's a container. We feel like, let's imagine, for example, we've got some time off, we're on a vacation, or it's a day of the week we're not working, and we can get ourselves to a place where we feel like we can actually take a nap. It's a sunny afternoon, we've come inside, it's cool, the fan's on, feels really, whatever word you want to use, it feels really wonderful. And so we let ourselves drift off. And we wake up, we don't just sleep, the whole night, but we wake up and it was as if we were doing something, we were feeling something, we were communicating something. So what I'm suggesting here is that sense of being overwhelmed is indicating in some way that the way in which our reality is constructed, completely acknowledging that we are thrown into the world and there's many things we have to face and do that we do not want to do and that aren't fair. Within that, we are making choices, and we can make choices. And if we can find a way to communicate within this, what's referred to here, I'm talking about the Psychoanalytic Zero, but seeing these aspects of how we structure our world, like panes of glass that we can look through, they're still there, but we look through them. Does that allow us to see the things that are overwhelming while being less overwhelmed? And so the example of falling asleep, I hope in some way illustrates that there are different ways in which we communicate within ourselves. That the idea of control, the idea of changing the world, the idea that we can do more than we can actually manage, the idea that we can add hours onto the day or days onto the week, all of those things are not really sensical, right? They're nonsensical. And they're nonsensical because we are staying within one way of understanding our world. So can we look to different ways of understanding our lives? Can we look at the way in which we're projecting onto the cashier who's just put that sign out that says, "Next cash, please"? Can we pick another option? Can we think maybe they're busy, or whatever it is that we think, it's okay. I'll check my phone for something, or you know what? I'll just take a minute to wait in line, and I'll just take 5 minutes and I'll just breathe. I'll think about something that happened earlier in the day. I'll maybe think about something I'm doing later on in the week, or maybe I'll just sit in this moment for a second. Maybe I'll just sit in this zero, this psychoanalytic zero, which is to say, maybe I'll just accept this moment as some container of experience, some expression of experience. However, it's different. And in exploring this, I'm allowing myself to be more than the things I do. And be, so to the Jon Kabat-Zinn line, as I understand it, is, we're human beings, we're not human doings. And the idea of doing and control and being overwhelmed and needing to do more limits our experience in a way that ignores the psychoanalytic zero, ignores that space where we can just be present, where we can allow another form of communication and existing, which is a form of self-regulation. Because when we are anxious and feel like we are running, when we feel like we're overwhelmed, we think, well, I can't self-regulate. I can't take a breath. I can't take a moment. I can't just stop and smell the roses. I can't do any of those things. And I'm not saying you can't, right? Maybe you can't, and maybe this podcast has zero relevance for you. Maybe it is the case that everything you're doing and the way you're doing it is completely necessary, and everything I've said just has no bearing on your life, right? Maybe it's not relevant in any way. Maybe, as a kind of aside, maybe you just fell asleep with this podcast on and it's rolling away and you woke up to hear me say you have choice, and you're like, yep, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Click, off it goes. That is a statement. That's an important statement. That's an invaluable statement saying, I don't have enough time to self-regulate. To say to yourself, I don't have enough time to smell the roses. That's really, 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 really important. Acknowledging the feeling that we have, that we do not have enough time for ourselves, that we do not have enough time to self-regulate, to smell the roses, to take a breath, and owning that experience of, I don't have the time, so you're not going to tell me I do. We need to explore exactly where we are. And so I made this point more in the first podcast of this series, but I want to make it again here. In no way should this be like 5 steps to not feeling overwhelmed. This is not what this is about. This is about exploring. And if you're saying, Jordan, you are insane, this makes no sense, that cashier put that sign up because they are angry at me, because they're a bad person, because all of these different things, then that's where you are. The question I have is, in addition to that, not either or, but in addition, in a polyphonic kind of way, in a multitudinal, pluralistic kind of way, can we add to the dimensions of our worlds? Can we add to the experience of our life? Can we say, yes, I do not have time to smell the roses, and I wonder why they put that sign up. And I wonder if there's something else I can do for dinner than what I had planned. Or I wonder if there's something else I can do besides this career. Or I wonder if I could just take 3 breaths even though I know it's not going to work. So I hope this furthers the thinking and the discussion about how we can explore these things without shame and without negating what is really, really important to our lived experience. So, as always, you can find me at JordanO'Connor.com. All right, thanks a lot, and bye for now.